In the Middle East and also in Israel, there is never a dull moment. While negotiations on the judicial reform continue, the coalition managed to buy some peace and quiet last week after passing the two-year budget. At the same time, regional developments such as the Turkish elections continue to be the hot topic of international headlines. And in the local arena, the terror continues to strike, as an Israeli citizen was murdered yesterday after being shot by Palestinian militants. I'm Elie Klutstein, content manager for the Jerusalem Press Club. We're happy to host today Ruth Wasserman Lande, former member of the Knesset between 2021 and 2022, former deputy ambassador to Egypt, and an expert in the field of international diplomacy. Our conversation will focus on regional issues in Israeli politics and will range from Syria to Iran, Egypt, and the US. Hi, Ruth. Thank you for joining us.
Very welcome, Elie. How are you?
Good. Let me start with regional issues. World leaders from every corner of the globe congratulated this week Erdogan for his victory in the Turkish elections. This disregarding the fact that he is silencing free journalism and his political rival. What does this say on global and regional priorities, or about the general attitude of nowadays diplomacy in general?
Well, I think I won't be surprising anyone if I say that realpolitik is what drives world politics in the international arena. Of course, Turkey is a hugely important country, both geographically and in terms of its size. First and foremost, let's speak about Israel, Elie. I mean, if we look at the geographical positioning of Turkey, and the potential that we have as Israel in terms of cooperating both on the geostrategic level as well as on the economic level, it's obvious that we need to try at least and make relations work. And this has been done in the past few years, particularly recently by the current president, Bougie Herzog. And there has been some kind of a rapprochement, very much felt in the past year, specifically when Erdogan himself felt that the economic situation within his country was reaching a point where he needed regional partners. And that is what drives other countries in the world as well. There are issues pertaining to formulating some kind of a coalition vis-a-vis Iran in the region, but also the economic issues pertaining to gas and energy and so on. Plus, Turkey has been for the past years basically a kind of a go-between for ISIS operatives, for Kurdish insurgents, for those who are opposed to the Syrian current rule, and countries that wish to gain any kind of ground in terms of regional stability need to take Turkey into account. This goes without saying, I feel, and there is a trend specifically now, driven by Saudi Arabia, by the United Arab Emirates and so on, to do what's right for one's country. Realpolitik, I said at the beginning. Okay,
and now let's look at it from the Turkish perspective. Erdogan has been playing between the so-called West and East, flirting both with NATO and Russia, Iran, China. Will he could continue pursuing this policy in the near future, or maybe in the long term, maybe as well?
So this is a very interesting question. I think that it would be very important to watch and preserve the rapprochement that has begun with Israel, for us at least, but as I said, also for other countries. I think that now, after the elections, it will be a little bit easier for Erdogan, to maneuver himself, because he basically fortified his positioning and his power. Which he is very good at doing. He's been doing it for quite a while. He knows the works, he knows the system, and he will take care to fortify his positioning even more. Already, we can see it vis-a-vis his negotiation with Europe and the United States, whether Sweden will join NATO or will not, and what will be the price that he will demand for Turkey itself. thinking that perhaps making his air power greater and receiving a huge sum of money is not enough anymore and needing to be compensated even further. I think this is an indication perhaps as to the fact that he feels stronger after repositioning himself following the elections. I do feel that from the Turkish perspective, there are also geostrategic issues pertaining to intelligence and security that are relevant in terms of its will to cooperate with Israel. And I certainly hope so, because we do as well. And we'll have to continually watch carefully how this plays out now that his positioning is more fortified.
Okay, the probably the most major issue you not mentioned specifically, but it's the Iranian threat. And we've seen yesterday our President Bougie Herzog visiting Azerbaijan, and what seems to be maybe a continuance of an Israeli move to engage with Iran's neighbor following the opening of an embassy in Turkmenistan last month. What is the rationale of this process? Do you think it will help Israel on Judgment Day, maybe?
Without a doubt, it will help. There's no other reason. There's no other, let's say, potential analysis that could point otherwise. First of all, we had very good relations with Azerbaijan for years, but they had been strengthened lately. There's been a very ambassador in Israel recently appointed. And also, of course, the president going there is a clear message both to Iran, but also de facto, operatively, concretely, in terms of cooperation. The least important, but still very important, is on the energy and economic level. But as you yourself had said, Elie, the Iranian geostrategic intelligence and security cooperation is vastly important. Not only does Azerbaijan and Turkmenistan neighbor Iran, but there's a huge attempt by Iran, as with other countries, but specifically with her neighbors, to export its arms, its influence, its presence into those countries. And there's reason to believe that fortified relations between Israel and those countries would be extremely helpful. You call it the Day of Judgment. You can choose your name, but when it will count.
Okay, this actually leads me to my next question, which is the Iranian involvement in this specific area and involvement where it pushes Islamic Jihad and Hamas maybe to attack Israel, to launch attacks from Gaza, from the West Bank. You've been the deputy ambassador in Cairo, and you are very familiar with the Egyptian involvement via Israeli policy regarding Hamas, Gaza Strip, Islamic Jihad. What do you think about the Egyptian involvement? Is it going to continue? What's the purpose of the Egyptians in this move? And how does this play against Iran specifically?
So this is very interesting because Egypt has been, let's say, a little bit allergic to the Iranian attempt to export its power to every single country in the region, not excluding Egypt itself, but they were having none of that. In other words, when Iran was trying to make present in the Egyptian Republic its own operatives in terms of collecting intelligence and so on, Egypt was very quick to act. They threw the ambassador out, all diplomatic relations were cut. There were a lot of tensions regarding the fact that Iran was sanctuaring, basically, for lack of a better word, the murderer of Islambuli, the Palestinian murderer of Sadat. The Egyptians gave a very prestigious burial in the center of Cairo to the Shah. A very tense relationship has been between Egypt and Iran for years. And yet we see, as we see with Saudi Arabia and Iran and other countries with Iran lately, a kind of a rapprochement. In my humble opinion, this is not a love story. This is not a rosy end of the tension, but rather an interest-based kind of an attempt to lower the flames and lower the tension and try and seek some kind of a stability. So in terms of Cairo, obviously, their interest of regional stability when it pertains to Hamas being armed, trained, and so on by Iran and other factors in the region. For example, sending or trying to send them to the Sinai Peninsula and so on, and obviously disrupting what for Cairo is hugely important, and that is not allowing regional instability to leak into its own borders. And that has been really what has been behind Cairo's interest in trying to preserve some kind of a stability vis-a-vis the Israeli-Arab conflict in Gaza. Having said all of that, Iran is not resting. Not only had it basically destroyed Lebanon, entering it, destroying its economy, basically disintegrating its political system, which is very useful for Iran because then it grows its own influence from within, fortifying its own arm, Hezbollah, which has been already recognized by, if not all, most intelligence apparatuses around the world. But Lebanon was not enough. Of course, it's very much fortifying its presence in Syria. Israel is very aware of that, making every effort to stop its own fortification as close as possible in terms of the Iranian interest to Israeli borders up north. But it hasn't stopped there either. And what is less spoken about is the Iranian attempt to also infiltrate Jordan, which is relatively weak, and suddenly finding Shiite sites in Jordan, which are extremely surprisingly or not so close to the Israeli border, which it needs to take care of. Jordan is much weaker than Egypt and has less possibility to stop the Iranians from infiltrating its borders. It does that not only in Jordan, but believe it or not, it's already beginning to try and influence, apart from the Hezbollah in the north and the Hamas in the south, but Israeli Arabs holding Israeli passports from within, not only disrupting the Al-Aqsa Mosque, doing untold things in a very holy place for the Islam, which is playing football and bringing arms into the Holy of Holies, which is quite absurd if you think about it from a Muslim or Islamic point of view. But in fact, going into de facto Israeli cities like Nazareth and infiltrating its Shiite teachings, much to the grievance, by the way, of Sunni sheikhs inside Israel, holding Israeli passports and trying to create cells from within Israel to counter the Israeli security system and so on, and try to create instability. So the Iranian attempt to disintegrate political systems, apart from fortifying its strength and military strength in the seas, apart from trying to weaken American presence in the region, is a real threat to, let's say, not moderate, but at least stable regimes throughout the region. And this should definitely light a very big red cautionary point to all countries seeking stability.
Okay, you just mentioned Syria. And I was wondering, lately we've seen Syria being reintroduced into the Arab countries family. And I wonder if this process can affect in any way Israeli engagement with the country or even renew negotiations with Assad. Can it limit our operational capabilities there?
Okay, so those are two very different things. To speak to the Assad regime, I don't see that happening in the near future, quite frankly. Coming into the Arab League is definitely, I would say, another signal of a general trend in the region right now of rapprochement, led, by the way, by Saudi Arabia. Why does Saudi Arabia want this? Despite the fact that they didn't like what they saw Assad doing to his own people, the mass killings, the horrid civil war that's been going on there for years, simply because Saudi Arabia wants a more insular policy to get Saudi Arabia richer, more stable, and more accepted into the international arena. To do that, it needs regional stability to get Iran basically off its back, to have Iran stop arm and train Houthis, basically harassing Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which it did very well with the agreement that it signed with Iran. And I believe that this is what stands behind its own maneuvering to get Saudi Arabia back into the Arab League. And it will allow it to have it
Syria,
and other countries, Syria, of course, not Iran, to have more influence and leverage over what Assad does. So that's regarding the embrace that I wouldn't call it, again, a newly found infatuation, but rather a very much interest-based wish to focus on internal matters by MBS and MBZ, my apologies, and to really get Saudi Arabia in a more stable economic and security, I would say, angle. Regarding the possibility of changing the Israeli way of looking at Assad and the way it can maneuver itself from within, you know what? Israel has no choice but to take care of its own citizens. Perhaps it sounds like a line. This is just what it is. And given the ongoing attempt of Iran to try and move both weapons and capabilities into Syria, which it's doing all the time, Israel is not going to take into account any restrictions vis-a-vis its operations in the Syrian arena, even if it means that it will be a little bit more risky. Another thing that I would say is that current, or rather undercurrent, agreements will, I believe, allow Israel to function in Syria, given the wish of all countries involved to maintain the regional stability.
Okay, let's move on to the local arena. You were also a member of the Knesset, so you probably, like everyone else in Israel, you have an opinion about the judicial reform, about the protests, the talks in the president's house, which resumed yesterday. Do you think there's a really chance here for a compromise?
Look, the chances are not big and they're not very optimistic. My own humble opinion regarding the reform, there needs to be a judicial reform, certainly not in the way that it's been handled, not very quickly, not without some kind of a very large macro agreement between different factions of the coalition and the opposition. Certainly not in the manner that it's been done, which really undermines a lot of the checks and balances, which, by the way, in Israel are fragile. Israel was established on the basis of, a kind of a declaration of independence rather than a constitution, thereby not having that check and balance as is, for example, in place in the US. Another check and balance that doesn't exist is a second house of legislation, which Israel does not have, meaning basically that the High Court of Law and the Supreme Court is the only check and balance to the legislature and the executive arm. To take that away, or rather to decrease its own influence in a significant manner very quickly, without taking into account that you're basically nullifying a lot of the checks and balances, if not all of them, regarding the centralization of power, would be at best, and I'm saying it diplomatically, unwise, destabilizing, undemocratic, and I'm against it. That's not to say that I'm not for judicial reform. I think it's important. I think that it needs to be looked at after 75 years. It needs to be resumed and also a lot of the people that are in favor of the judicial reform need to feel part and parcel and represented by the Supreme Court. Just for that, it's worth opening the issue and seeing how that system may, even by feeling, make more people feel part and parcel of it, whether their feeling is justified or not. There needs to be a true representation of the Supreme Court and the judicial system of the vast majority of the population of Israel. And I do feel that an independent judicial system in Israel, which has been a beacon of light, hope, of pride to the Israeli democracy, needs to be maintained.
Okay, but can this be done with the current coalition? Gabi Ashkenazi, who was the chief of staff of the IDF and was a foreign affairs minister representing your party, just said that he thinks this is the time for a joint government together with the Likud. Do you think this is true?
I know that Gabi Ashkenazi's former Minister of Foreign Affairs opinion is that it has been for a long time to have a unity government. At the moment, this is not realistic. This is not something that is possible, in my opinion. There has been really no trust between every single leader of every single political faction in the country that is not in the coalition at the moment and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. This huge lack of trust simply prevents from any of the parties from joining, including Benny Gantz's party at this particular point. And the question is, what will Netanyahu do? The way that I analyze it, he doesn't want the judicial reform. He wants perhaps a certain judicial reform, but a very moderate one. Certainly the raison d'etre of the Likud, a liberal right-wing party, does not wish the likes of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir to have their, let's say, walk and belief in life implemented in politics for Israel. I don't believe he wants that. He finds himself in a very, very intense, difficult coalition. And there will need to be some thinking, creative thinking about how to allow him to come out of this difficult situation while not allowing for a huge judicial reform to take place very quickly without not even consensus, but more consensual base amidst the people in Israel. But not only that, I don't believe it needs to come to a unity government to allow Benjamin Netanyahu to slowly come off his ladder with respect, with honor, with a possibility to maintain his heritage and what he gave to the country, which is not something marginal.
So considering all what you've said right now, what is the likelihood of another round of elections? And maybe a more personal question, are you going to try again run in the future to the Knesset?
So let's begin with the second one because it's very easy for me to answer. Certainly the answer is yes. I came to this country when I was 17 from South Africa, took a few steps here and there, very much involved in hopefully what's good for the country. I care a lot and I see myself definitely running again and joining the political arena. I don't see this happening. Perhaps I'm wrong, but for whatever it's worth in the next few years, simply for the reason of every single portion of the current coalition understanding that nobody else wants them except the current makeup of the coalition. And therefore, they have absolutely nothing to search for in a renewed round of elections. So whatever disagreement there may be between different factions, and God knows that there are lots of disagreements. I just mentioned one of them between Netanyahu and Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. They have extremely different takes on political life. And nonetheless, they all understand that there's no other way out of it except a unity government, which currently, in my opinion, as I said, is unrealistic. And therefore, I believe that the current coalition is unfortunately stable for the next few years. Yes, I shall definitely run in the next round of elections.
Okay, this was very, very interesting, but I'm afraid our time is up. Ruth Wasserman Lande, thank you very much for your time. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Elie. Have a good day.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.